Hey everybody, it's Courtney. I'm here with a project using the July 2019 kit from Club La La Land Crafts. So just giving you a quick look at what comes in the kit. We have two sets of red rubber stamps here. We have Coffee Mug Marcy as well as these cute little hamsters. Along with the stamps, we have some dies. We have the coffee sentiment, and this is all one piece, but it all cuts out separate words. We have the two little coffee mugs with a little whipped cream on top, as well as the coffee pot. So jumping right into the project here, I'm going to go ahead and stamp out Marcy here on a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I am using Blackout ink by Ink on 3, and you can see that I have some cat hair stuck to my stamp. And those of us who have pets know what a disaster that can be. So my first impression, not so great. I have some lines there from where those cat hairs were, so I did have to restamp her onto a new piece of Neenah Solar White. I could have probably just covered it up with a white gel pen, but it was just easier for me to restamp it. So I'm going to speed up the coloring here because the coloring for this takes quite a bit of time. I am starting off with her skin tones here, and I'm just mapping out the darkest areas with my lightest color first, then going in with the darkest color to add in those shadows. So the shadows are going to be underneath where her hair is hanging over her face, on the inside of her little arms, and where she's holding that mug. I'm also creating two little kind of not squiggly, kind of curved lines where her nose would be, just to give her that a little shape. And then on either side of her ankles, because this would be kind of a rounder object, I guess. So highlight would be in the center. Next, I'm going to blend this out each time a little bit further with each color as I go down, and then finally I will finish off with that lightest color that we started with. I'm also going to add a little bit of color to her cheeks with an R21, and then quickly go over that area again with that lightest skin tone color, just to kind of tone that down just a teeny tiny bit. I also added a little color to her lips, and I didn't do any shading here. I just added just a little bit of color. Next, we're going to move on to her hair, and there's a couple different ways that you can do hair, and I know I've had several comments that people sometimes struggle with hair. So I'm going to try to explain this the best I can, but to be quite honest with you, it just takes practice. So for hair, I typically start with my darkest color. This part is optional. I just like the texture it gives by kind of maintaining those flick lines. You can see that my marker is almost straight up and down as I'm adding my flicks, which shows that I'm just using the very tip of my marker. My flick lines are going to be different lengths. So you can see that some are a little bit longer than others, and this will add some texture to the hair. And I'm also flicking in the direction of her hair. So you can see as her bangs are kind of hanging down, that's more curved. My flick lines will also be curved. Moving on to the darkest mid-tone, I'm just extending these flicks out a little bit further, but you can see that I'm not really going over the same area too many times. The more you go over it, the more the colors are going to blend together. While I want them to blend, I don't want them to create a seamless blend like we sometimes want. But for hair, I don't. I want to maintain that texture. Quickly going over the highlight areas with that lightest color, again, making sure I don't go over it too many times so that I don't lose those flick lines. To make her hair look even darker in those darkest areas, I'm going to go in with a W7, and I'm just going to add smaller flicks than I did before, just in the very darkest areas. And then in certain areas, you may have to blend that out, but for the most part, this is just going to add more contrast. So moving on to her clothing, for her pants here, I'm going to make these jeans. So I'm going to be using my B90 markers. Same for her little vest. This will be a little denim vest. Starting off with the lightest color to map out those darkest areas. You can see on the bottom portion of her little vest there, I did add little triangles where it would be kind of gathered or folded. I'm just going to add a little bit of color there in the shape of a triangle. So each time I blend that out, I'm just going to make that triangle a little bit longer and a little bit wider. And then once all the coloring is done, that will appear as if it's kind of just folded or wrinkled there. For her pants, I'm just concentrating on a center highlight, and you can see that I'm adding 2 little flick lines in the center there where her little knees would be. Again, this will just add a little bit of shape to her pants. Moving on to the B93, and I'm just leaving a very, very tiny little area for that highlight color, which is the B91. And then we'll move on to her little coffee mug there. Now I want this to appear white, so I'm going to be bringing out my C markers, my cool gray markers. Any white object is still going to have shadows or shading. So I'm going in with a very, very dark color with a C7, but you can see that I'm only adding a teeny tiny bit of that on either side of the mug, as well as where her hand is holding the mug. That would also create a shadow. For her little headband there, I want that to be white as well. I'm just adding a few little flicks from where it's tucked behind her hair. That would be the darkest area. For her shoes, it would be on either side and more towards the bottom portion of the shoe. I guess it would be like the sole, I believe. So that the top portion, the middle top, would be where the highlight color is. I blended those areas out with the C5 and then moving on to the C3, and I'm flicking these colors out a little bit further. My lightest color is the C1, but you can see that I am leaving some white space here on the mug especially, as well as her shoes. To get rid of some of those flick lines so that I just don't have that much of a harsh line, I'm quickly going over the white area slightly into the C1 area with my colorless blender, and this will give me a more of a seamless blend. For her shirt, I wanted a little bit of pop of color here, so I'm going to bring in my RV20s. Again, starting off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas. Her vest would cast a shadow on her shirt, and her mug would also cast a shadow on the bottom portion of her shirt. Going in with the darkest color, then the 2 mid-tone colors, and then once again finishing off with that highlight color for the center portion mainly of her shirt. Going to add the whites of her eyes back in with a white gel pen, and then I went ahead and fussy cut her out. Next, we're going to go ahead and color the dies, and I'm going to speed this up even more. I went ahead and die cut everything, added some Tombow Mono multi glue to the backs of the dies, spread that out with my finger and let that dry, and then I just stick it to a scrap piece of paper. This makes the coloring a little bit easier for me. That way the dies aren't shifting around, or I don't have to hold them down as I'm doing my coloring. Now I'm going to show you the coloring of everything here. However, I don't end up using everything. So for that heart, that is actually going to be the center of the little teapot, so that would naturally have a center highlight. So I added just a little bit of shading on either side of that. For the letters, I'm just basically adding shading wherever I want, with the exception of the 2 E's. These 2 E's go in the center of those little coffee cups there, or coffee mugs. So again, these would also have a center highlight for that entire object, including what is inside the object. So I used those same RV20s that I used for her shirt, and I'm going to go ahead and color this coffee mug as well with those same RV20s. And this time I'm showing you flicking motions. I prefer using flicking motions just because I feel like I get a better blend. But I've also received a lot of comments that some people are just not able to master the flicking motion, which does take a lot of practice. But you don't need to do the flicking motions. So you can still get a pretty good blend and pretty good results by not necessarily doing the flicks. And I'll show you that just in a second here. I'm just going to color this smaller mug here with those same B90 markers that I used for her shirt, or no, I'm sorry, her vest and her pants. And then next we're going to bring in some, I colored this mug the same way, but here I'm not using flicking motions. I'm just pretty much doing straight lines up and down. And you may have to go over the same area a little bit more than you would if you were using flicking motions, but you can still see that I got a pretty good blend. I'm going to use some W markers for this little whipped cream, and I'm going to go over it quite a few times with the colorless blender just to kind of tone that down a little bit. For this coffee pot, I am bringing in those W markers, or those warm grays. And again, going to use straight lines up and down. Now, I didn't saturate the paper first. I went in right with my darkest color, so you'd probably get a better blend if you went in with your lightest color first. But you can see I'm just using straight lines up and down, keeping that center highlight being it is a a round object. But you can see that I got a pretty good blend and it does look round. So keep that in mind, that just because you haven't mastered the flick yet doesn't mean that you can't get good results. So just going to finish off the card using this, the die cuts, coloring in this little coffee bean here and this second mug, or not mug, coffee cup. It's like a to-go cup. Again, going to use some of those W markers, but this time not going quite as dark because I want this to be a lot lighter than that coffee pot itself. So once all of that was done, we are going to go ahead and add some white gel pen details to Marcy, first fixing up any coloring errors where I went out of the lines. And then I added just a few polka dots to her shirt just so that not everything is completely solid. Next, we're going to go ahead and assemble the card, and I used a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock and the scalloped stitched rectangle die, and this is also by La La Land. And I'm just going to kind of place everything down because I really wasn't sure how I wanted to put this card together. I just stamped it and die cut everything and figured I would figure it out as I went along, which I pretty much did. So I was going to use the coffee sentiment, the coffee die. And at first, when I'm kind of layering everything together, I did kind of like it. But once I started assembling it, you'll see that I did change my mind. So for it's not actually the card base, but it's the size of the card base. For that back sheet there, it's also a piece of Neenah Solar White. I felt like I needed a little bit more of that pink. So I'm bringing out that scrap piece of paper again, and I'm taking the RV25, which is actually the darkest mid-tone that we used for her shirt and some of those mugs. And I'm just going to color the 4 sides of this card panel here. This way it'll look like I used a pink sheet of cardstock here that matches perfectly with her shirt and the coffee mugs, but it's just a white sheet of paper. And I do this often. I very rarely use colored cardstock. If I'm going to have everything match, I'd rather just color it in myself and make sure that it is a perfect match. So now that I have all of those die cut pieces kind of temporarily stuck to that white panel there because I have that Tombow Mono multi glue on the back, I went ahead and placed that down onto my colored piece of cardstock there, and I figured I was going to go with it at this point, but I needed a little bit of color to that white panel there. So I'm going to bring out Picked Raspberry Distress Oxide ink as well as a blender brush, and I am just going to basically dab on just a little bit of the ink. I'm not adding a ton of ink here, and off camera I am dabbing this off onto a scratch piece of paper just so that I don't have too much ink going onto my panel. I just need a little bit of color here, mainly where Marcy is going to be. I'm not really worried about the rest of the panel, just as long as it's showing through a little bit around her. She's kind of the main focus of the card. So I did like that a lot better. So we're going to go ahead and assemble the card, and here is where I'm going to change my mind once again. I adhered that white panel down to that colored panel there with my Tombow Mono multi glue flat, and then I popped up Marcy with some Scotch foam tape and adhered the little coffee pot as well as just one of the mugs along with that little piece or little pile, I guess, of whipped cream there. And these die cuts fit perfectly. You'll notice that the little mug there has a little slit in it where the whipped cream will fit right into it. I usually make sure that I add a little bit of adhesive to the back of it where it is tucked in just to make sure it doesn't shift around, but it does fit perfectly in there. That way you don't have to really mess with the placement. It's already done for you. So I pop those on, or I adhere those flat around Marcy, and then I began adding my sentiment. I had a little bit of a smudge there, so I wanted to cover that up with the C. And then I kind of started arranging my other letters from that point, and I really didn't like it. I know my F's were kind of hanging above the card a little bit too much, but I just wasn't feeling it. So I decided that I was going to go with a different sentiment. So I went ahead and removed those, and I'll save those for another card. And I carefully removed that C. That's a great thing about using wet glue, is because you do have a couple of minutes to change your mind. I did stick that coffee bean down and die cut and colored another one to cover up that little area where that C was. There was a little bit of adhesive, and just a little tiny bit of the paper was torn. You probably can't see it on camera, but it was very, very easy to cover up. So I am going to take a stamp, one of the stamps for the sentiment, and without using my MISTI, I tried to stamp this directly onto my card panel with that Picked Raspberry Distress Oxide ink. And of course, it was extremely crooked. So I'm just going to go ahead and cover that up. So I'm going to take another piece of Neenah Solar White, and this is just a scrap piece here, bringing out one of those warm gray markers to add a little bit of color to the background. And I'm, again, just scribbling this down. You can make any color cardstock you want for anything by doing this. Going to treat that with my anti-static tool, stamping out that same sentiment with some embossing ink and sprinkling on some white embossing powder, and I will go ahead and heat set that. I do make sure that my heat gun is completely heated up before bringing that to the paper, just to prevent or minimize any warping. I went ahead and cut this down. It was stamped crooked again, so it took a little bit of maneuvering, but I finally was able to get this cut pretty straight, or at least straight enough where you can't notice. And then I'm just going to pop this up with some Scotch foam tape directly over where I stamped that crooked sentiment to begin with, and nobody will even know that it was ever there. So I am going to go ahead and finish off the card with a little bit of sparkle to that heart that is in the center of that coffee pot. And once I added the sparkle with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen, I went ahead and added a little bit of glossy accents. Oh, I did add some white gel pen details too. Forgot about that. And I'll finish off with some glossy accents just over that heart. Now, when you first put this down, it will be very cloudy. Just let it dry, give it at least an hour or two, and then you'll see that it will be completely clear. But that is it. That is the card for today. I'm going to go ahead and link all the supplies below, as well as my blog where I have another card using the same kit. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day.